All right, so you just heard the very well-known "Help Me, Rhonda," which actually this is the first version of it, spelled Ronda on this album, Beach Boys Today. They would eventually release it again on Summer Days, Summer Nights about 6 months later, and at that point it would be "Help Me, Rhonda," Ronda, and it's a
Was that a
slightly
different Rondo?
it is. It's a very it could be a different Rhonda altogether. Yeah, female, but it's definitely a different song, and it doesn't. And it's usually the one from Summer Days, Summer Nights is the one that shows up on more of the greatest hits albums. But for my money, I actually like the version on Today better. So right off the bat, if you're a Help Me Rhonda fan, go ahead and listen to both of them and let us know which one you prefer. But
Yeah,
so
I'm gonna have to. I didn't know there was another version. I'm gonna have to listen to that.
yes, I'll be curious to hear what you guys say. Perhaps that can go into Josh's tidbits next week.
Yeah.
In terms of
I didn't even know. I didn't even know that this version of "Help Me, Rhonda" didn't have the H in, because I wrote in my notes "Help Me, Rhonda" with an H, so I'm not even paying attention to spellings.
Yes, later on they would correct it and there would be not. But on the original one, if you look at the album cover on the original ones, you'll see how it was originally spelled. So just a little tidbit right there. But without going into a big bio on the Beach Boys, because we're gonna have another Beach Boys album that's pretty well known later on in this. I think here's probably what I want you to know about the Beach Boys right off the front. And guys, you can jump in whenever you want. I think a lot of people, when they think of the Beach Boys, they think of it as like a two-person. The two members of the band are way outsized, and I think that's like Brian Wilson, who's the eccentric genius, right, and Mike Love, who's the sort of guy who's made them into an oldies band / lead singer of the band. I think sometimes people forget that there's three other members of the group. The other two Wilsons, Dennis and Carl, who also were musicians. Dennis played the drums and Carl played the lead and rhythm guitar pretty well, actually. Well enough that he was part of the instrumentation on this, as we'll talk about. And then Al Jardine, who sort of has the rep of being the easygoing Beach Boy. And Mike Love was actually cousins with the Wilson brothers. And Al Jardine was just a friend of theirs from high school. He was actually Brian Wilson's high school football teammate, which I thought was interesting to think of Brian Wilson playing high school football. Apparently he's pretty good too. But yeah, so that's
I think it's funny that Al Jardine played football, because he doesn't look like a big dude at all.
I was going to say, yeah, it's definitely a different time, I think. But that's, when you think back then, the NFL, right? They had like 180-pound defensive tackles. So who knows, in California at that time.
I could have had a different career in a different decade. So
exactly, it could be. So I think I won't go into a long biography on the Beach Boys. Let's just say it's kind of exactly what you'd think. They started singing for their very demanding father. And I mean, there's plenty of pop culture movies that you can watch about the Wilsons' father, who was sort of at the beginning the ingenue of the band, and sort of, along with the Wilsons and, the others, would have these demanding sessions where nothing was ever good enough and struggled with substance abuse. This album, Beach Boys Today, sort of is a year after, when they kind of set him adrift and said, yeah, thanks a lot, but no thanks. If you want to hear some pretty interesting listening, if you go onto YouTube, you can actually hear some of the sound tapings for this album with the Wilsons' father in the studio. And to say he was quite a handful in the recording sessions it's sort of underrated. It's also interesting to hear the various people react to him. You really can get an insight into their personalities, especially Brian Wilson's, as he's trying to arrange the album, but also placate his father. It's a very interesting slice of history if you listen to it. But by this point, I think this is what you need to know about the Beach Boys at this point. The Beach Boys had basically been doing surf music for 3 years at this point, 61, 62, 63. At about 64, they'd kind of gotten tired of doing the surf music. This is also where the band starts to get the identity that I think when people talk about the Beach Boys as a artistically gifted band, this is about the period where they start talking about them as an artistically gifted band. And so this is where, with the exception of a couple different songs like In My Room, right, that are in early Beach Boys that kind of show what's to come, Beach Boys Today sort of represents when they took a step forward as true artists. It's when Brian Wilson sort of takes the reins a lot more than he did before. and began arranging and changing different stuff up. And I'm sure we'll talk about the stark difference in side A of this album and side B of this album. But the other thing we can talk about is when you listen to the mono and the stereo version of this album, in some ways it sounds like a very different album. And they're both available on Spotify if you listen to them, especially with headphones. Before I get into a little bit of the history leading up to this album, and it is very interesting, what you guys think of the Beach Boys? Because they're like a loaded band in some ways, I think, because it's hard to not think of the Beach Boys as a nostalgia act and like the group that sang Kokomo on Full House and stuff. But I think that, unlike the Beatles who ended early, right, and never got to grow old, right, and, tour stadiums too old as the Stones, or lose their voice like Roger Daltrey and the Who, or become whatever the hell, the Beach Boys have become the last 20 years, right? What are your views on the Beach Boys heading into this? Josh, maybe we'll start with you.
I always knew them from the oldie stations, like I said before. Listening to this album, I was wondering if they were a nostalgia act even in '65 when this album came out, because it sounds so different than things that we've listened to up to this point, and compared to what other albums came out in '65. It sounds like from a more naive time and place than where things were at in '65. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's a little more about this album, my initial thoughts on it.
Gotcha. What about you, Matt? I know you're well. You've talked over the years a lot about your thoughts on Mike Love to me. But what are your thoughts on the Beach Boys?
So I appreciate the Beach Boys. I respect them. I was surprised. I mean, like Josh, when early memories of the Beach Boys were just kind of like the fun surf music. I don't remember particularly, being a huge fan of theirs as a kid. They were fine. They were just kind of there. It's like, oh, there's this old band, right? I was surprised to learn later on that, about Pet Sounds. We're definitely going to be talking about that later, about how influential and important and revered that album is, and particularly to the Beatles. It was, but I've never been a huge Beach Boys fan. I've kind of, as I was listening to this album, I was really trying to decipher the reasons for that. And I think part of it for me is, and I don't know, John, when they get into and I don't know if it's Carl or Brian Wilson who does the high-pitched vocals.
That would be Brian Wilson, who sings the falsetto. Wilson. Yep.
Okay, so the scooping falsetto that is very apparent in a lot of their songs, regardless of, it's in Pet Sounds and it's in early stuff as well. It gets a little bit much for me. And I think one of the things I appreciate about this album is it's a shorter album. So I don't have to, it's something that can kind of happen quickly and be over with, So I think it would be harder for me to get through a longer album, because it just seems, it's at times for me, it seems a bit much. Oddly enough, there's plenty of stories about Mike Love about, being kind of a not the easiest person to get along with, and kind of an arrogant jerk. But I actually, when his voice comes in, I'm much more comfortable with his voice generally. I'm not saying that it's better, because I think the Beach Boys had ridiculously good harmonies and the production level is insane. But it never, so I can appreciate it on one hand, but it never got to the point where I was like, I love this, these and becoming like a top tier band for me.
I should have not done this before I finished the bio, because I so much to say in terms of my views on this comparatively. But let me finish the bio real quick before I go back into some of that, because I need to change the narrative a little bit on this album, I think. But basically, this album, the thing you need to know is that by this point, the Beach Boys, I keep saying the thing you need to know. There's a lot you need to know. But one thing that's interesting about this album is they do the surf albums, and then they release a Christmas album, which I'm sure you've heard Little Saint Nick, an original song that they did on that, which is a staple a
Run,
staple.
run, reindeer.
A staple. Yes, it's the little Saint Nick. It's a staple
Yeah,
around.
we could all sing it right now.
Well, and that's something I'm going to get to in a second, which I think is important about the Beach Boys, but we'll get there. But anyway, around this time, Brian Wilson suffers a nervous breakdown at the end of 1964. And for the rest of the 60s, the Beach Boys become a touring act, which features the other Wilsons, Mike Love, Al Jardine, and a hired session player who takes the place of Brian. Glenn Campbell, his name is. He takes the place, or excuse me, Bruce Johnston, I'm sorry. Who takes
Glenn Campbell.
Yeah, I was about to say yes. Well, but Glenn Campbell, believe it or not, was actually in the band for a couple of months. Yeah, but then he has his own career. He basically breaks and he's like, yeah, I can't do this anymore. So then Bruce Johnston replaces him. So yeah, a little bit of an interesting thing there. But what happens is at the end of 1964, there's the touring band. So there's Dennis and Carl Wilson, who are playing the drums and the guitar respectively. There's Mike Love, who's sort of taking on some of the falsetto portions of Brian Wilson, but also Bruce Johnston is taking some of those as well, because Brian Wilson didn't only sing in falsetto, he just would do that from time to time. Al Jardine's there, and what's happening is Brian Wilson is in the studio, and so instead of touring, he's basically recording the parts of the music of the Beach Boys with Phil Spector's wall of sound musicians. So we could have our own episode about Phil Spector and like the sound he made, but it's impossible to uncouple Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys sound, especially around this time and later, without thinking of Phil Spector, because Brian Wilson's musical idol was Phil Spector. And basically he was allowed to use all of Phil Spector's session musicians along with Carl, who was considered to be a really top-notch, surf guitarist, but also just a guitarist and rhythm guitarist in general. And so they would lay the music down, and then the Beach Boys would come in, the actual Beach Boys, the three Wilsons, Al Jardine, and Mike Love, and they would do the harmonies and basically record the vocal portion of the album separately. And that became a big piece of what the Beach Boys were later, like Brian Wilson tinkering around, them going out and touring incessantly without Brian Wilson, and then them coming back to the studio and coming together to provide the lush harmonies. So this album is the first that represents that period of the Beach Boys. So basically the musicianship you're hearing in this is Phil Spector's wall of sound musicians with every once in a while Dennis on drums and Carl on the rhythm guitar. So the musicianship, gets more sophisticated to get along.
So they're not
Brian
even
Wilson's
playing
doing.
on this album, really?
Carl is, and Dennis is occasionally.
Wow.
But Brian, from time to time is playing his parts. But you have to remember, only 3 of them played instruments to begin with.
Mike Love always just sits there and like bounces up and down with a tambourine and looks
he's
like a goon.
Well, and I'm gonna. So here I'm gonna jump in right now. As much as Matt loves and deifies the Beatles, there is no late career Beatles without the Beach Boys, because the Beach Boys took them. All of the things that the Beatles have rightfully been given plaudits for, there is no sophisticated Beatles without Brian Wilson tinkering and pushing them. And we talked about before, like when we said the Little Saint Nick, and everybody's like, we can sing that, right? This album alone, like I guarantee you, if having listened to this album, I could sing a portion, and I might even do this as a test right here. I could sing a portion of it, and you will immediately, both of you will want to jump in and sing along with it. But which part of it you sing could be different. Like, for example, if I said, don't hurt my little sister, you could go up, you could go down. And for each of the songs, I feel like one of the cool things is I never just sing Mike Love's part or just sing Brian Wilson's part or just sing Al Jardine's part. Like the great thing about the Beach Boys to me is they write these complex harmonies that are just incredible. And they come in at different points, and you can sing a Beach Boys song 3 times in a row and sing it from a different part. And you can even sing the different songs on the album. And that was what was fascinating to me. The first 6 songs on this album in particular, depending on what I was at, like I would hear it and just have to sing it. But then the second time I would listen to it, I realized I was singing a different portion of the song. And to me, that is the real genius of the Beach Boys, that they just, if we talk about the Beatles churning out hits, you want to talk about a singles band. I mean, my God, the Beach Boys were just churning singles out left and right. So, and some of my favorite Beach Boys songs are on this album. Help Me Rhonda is phenomenal. Don't Worry Baby is an incredible song. And then, the back end of this album is basically the rough draft for Pet Sounds, because it goes from all, upbeat, poppier songs into these ballads and introspective ballads, which are basically Brian Wilson sort of monkeying around, no pun intended, with what would become Pet Sounds. So I've gushed a little bit, but spoiler alert, I love this album, and I love this period of the Beach Boys in general. And I just wanted to get in there because I felt like we were sort of, when we started talking, what Josh said, are the Beach Boys a nostalgia act at that point? Hell no. They literally created the Beatles like they came later. They were being listened to by everybody around, and they were really the only thing in American pop music, because the Byrds weren't there yet, that were sort of holding a candle in terms of being able to put forth an American version of, what the British invasion was, but with a decidedly, as somebody said, like the Beach Boys wrote a lot of songs about like monogamy and getting married and, cars, like very American themes compared to like the more libertine Europe, So.
I appreciate the production values, and listening to the stereo versions of this album on headphones is like really rewarding. And comparing it to the mono versions, I think, though, when I say nostalgia act, it's more like they're writing like almost, or marketed directly to teenagers, right? They're writing about girlfriends. They're writing about, not getting married, or they're writing from the perspective of a high schooler. Like, when I grow up to be a man, like, you're too young to marry, things like that. And I couldn't, it kept grabbing my focus.
Okay.
Despite the songs being really infectious, and like, I mean, I was singing along too. Do You Want to Dance is like a great opening track. Dance, Dance, Dance. I love that song. And that's all. It's just completely about dancing. I mean, that title says it all, but that's what I mean. Like, was this band marketed specifically for teenagers in a way that other bands weren't? Because that songwriting, I don't think
that's the eternal argument between Mike Love and Brian Wilson. Brian Wilson always wanted to push into non-commercial entities. Mike Love he didn't want to write surf songs his entire life, but he always wanted to stay moored in pop sensibility. And, as time would go on, it would become more pronounced. I would argue that while Mike Love can be a handful, it probably was not the easiest thing in the world to be dealing with, a guy who shuts himself in his house for 4 years as well when you want to tour, and potentially make money. You know what I mean? So I think to some degree, people love a tortured artist, but I have a little bit of sympathy for Mike Love, where it's like, well, how long are we going to wait around for, stuff that might not even be stuff that I necessarily like, So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think while there are some like teenage-based songs, shallower songs, I do think there's a little bit of depth to some of those songs, Josh, that, When I Grew Up to Be a Man, I would argue is not necessarily a song directed at teenagers. I would say it's also Brian Wilson sort of reflecting on where he's going as a musician as well. So, and I'd also say, who the hell can sing numbers better than the Beach Boys? Because in the background, you're like listening to them going like 18, 19, and I'm like, Jesus, they even sing like a number countdown beautifully. You know what I mean? It's like not many people could get away with that. So.
All right, so I think I liked your point about the harmonies and how you can be singing different parts and you hear different things. I think that the Beatles did that too, but on a much lower, smaller scale, because this was just the Beach Boys sound, right? This was pretty much omnipresent in almost every song that they did, whereas the Beatles kind of had it peppered between songs. There was a lot of Lennon McCartney duets, but then they had some songs that Harrison came in that were really appreciate that aspect of it as well, that you're hearing and you can be singing different parts in the same song, which is one of the reasons I like the Beatles so much, and I do appreciate the Beach Boys. I would say that, that yes, the Beach Boys did push the Beatles and are very much, the reason that Sgt. Pepper came out was because of what they did with Pet Sounds, with the Beach Boys, a direct result of what with Pet Sounds was. But Pet Sounds was a direct result of Rubber Soul, right? So Brian Wilson, so it was a give and take, really,
back and forth.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Beatles, you could make the argument that they were as, influenced musically in different ways, but they were definitely influenced by Dylan, was a huge influence on the Beatles and caused them to be more introspective and change the lyrical.
Well, Dylan is as an originator for the Beatles as Phil Spector is for the Beach Boys. And that, I think, is what ultimately becomes, and what's so cool about this podcast is, as we look at not necessarily biases, but tendencies, getting into that, even when you were talking about the Beatles album, Matt, you were sort of like, I like the Beatles stuff more than the R&B and the soul stuff, but that takes away the Phil Spector stuff. You know what I mean? It's like a foundation of that. Whereas for me, that's the stuff that does it. And some of the early Dylan stuff, like, I could appreciate it, but it's like, as Josh said, homework for me a little bit. Whereas you'd never describe for me Phil Spector as homework. It just sounds beautiful. Like,
it's more accessible for sure.
Accessible is a loaded word, though. I feel like, especially the way you just said that. It's like accessible sometimes gets like not artistically as intense as Dylan and Beatles are, and I think a lot of that is inflated by, quite frankly, the narrative of what they put forward. The Beach Boys didn't have a lot of guile to them, and I think that's kind of what hurts them. And they didn't stop playing. And that's
and I didn't mean that as a negative, but I think a lot of Spector stuff he's doing in the 50s and the 60s and stuff is just like it's super, it's catchy, and it's interesting. And the Wall of Sound, man, he took a studio and made it full. Right. So I didn't mean that as a negative. It wasn't supposed to come off like that. But I think that I think that there's a number of different influences that all kinds of artists have. And that's just where they are today. I mean, Josh, the next album we're going to talk about, that's all. If it wasn't for that guy, and some of the other artists around that time, there wouldn't be any Beatles, So it all kind of piggybacks off of one another. I will say that I did find even though, I typically don't pay attention to lyrics, but this is a harder album to not pay attention to because it's so easy to follow along with what they're saying. But I thought that the 1-2, like "Don't Hurt My Little Sister" followed by "When I Grow Up" was very interesting, like lyrical content. How often do you hear pop or rock artists talk about the perspective of an older brother that's looking after his little sister and some guy that's treating her wrong? Like that's right. I found that to be a really interesting narrative.
Well, and little sister in this case is not a sibling of theirs. Little sister is actually the wife of one of Brian Wilson wrote it about the wife of his brother. So there's a little bit of loaded stuff in there as well. So
I didn't pick up on that at all.
Well, you wouldn't because he was writing direct stuff, but it, like "When I Grow Up," right, is kind of a teenage song like Josh heard it, but it's also sort of like, I just kicked my dad out of the band and now I'm sort of in charge of my musical stuff. And, I just discovered LSD, which he had before this, which is not surprisingly led to a profoundly creative period. So yeah, that's, can I read something that a guy named Daniel Harrison, Understanding Rock, wrote? Because I think it was an interesting quote. And he says about the Beach, he's sort of that school of thought that, while the Beach Boys are not quite the equal of the Beatles, they've sort of been posited as you have to, in order to see the genius of the Beatles, right? You have to sort of, depending on who you are, you either have to put down the Stones or put down the Beach Boys because they represent opposite counter narratives, right? Of what the Beatles represent. If the Beatles are the geniuses, right, there can only be one genius. And so, the Bob Dylan Beatles genius is a consensus that kind of won out. But his argument was sort of like, if you go with the singles and the Wall of Sound, the R&B one, it's kind of like they and the Beach Boys carry the narrative. And if you go with the blues and the Stones, right, and people feel like they have to pick one as like what represents the better instead of sort of viewing the 60s as what version of African American music do you want to follow? You know what I mean? Like, which way do you want to take it, kind of? And
Right.
yeah, and I do look at them that way. And he said, sort of, at this point, his quote was, "It was the profound vocal virtuosity of the group, coupled with the obsessional drive and compositional ambitions of their leader, Brian Wilson, that promised their survival after the eventual breaking of Fad Fever. They were so confident of their ability and of Brian's skill as a producer to enhance it, that they were unafraid of doing sophisticated a cappella, glee club, some would argue even uncool arrangements, but that contain multiple suspensions, passing formations, complex chords, and chromatic and harmonic modulations. If you view the voice as an instrument, you have to say that the Beach Boys were virtuosos." And that's where I'll just say, like, I do view the voice as an instrument, and to me, that means the Beach Boys were virtuoso musicians. And that's what a song like Good to My Baby, as, the lyrics are not much, but just as it leads into the chorus, if you listen to it in your headphones, just you can isolate each of the singers and what they're doing and how difficult it is. And Matt, I know you've sang before in different stuff. If we're talking about Good to My Baby, right? Good to my baby, good to my it's like going up, and then eventually it's like 5 different people singing the chorus in 5 distinct, it's almost like 5 race cars going out, and so just the sound of that song, it just sounds great. And so for me, I feel like I've gushed a little bit too much, but the Beach Boys, maybe it's because we're on quarantine and it just sounds awesome. Like, it just is an awesome sound. And sometimes you just want to hear people that can really sing and just make really good pop songs.
Well,
and that's what this album is.
Yeah, and I think I was talking to my brother earlier the week, and I told him, we were talking about this album a little bit, and he just mentioned it. That's a fun album, and it is, and I'm more of a Beatles guy for sure, and I talked a little bit about some reservations I have with the Beach Boys, but overall, I'm not going to disagree with that they're virtuosos, and the talent and all that, and the complexity, and I think that that's definitely to be appreciated. But this is a fun album overall. I liked it more as I listened to it. I love probably other than Help Me Rhonda, which I think is probably the strongest song on here, the verses are so good at that. That is just such a great, the verse. I oddly enough, actually, I thought the chorus was a little muffled. I know Wilson was kind of fading in and out of the chorus a little bit much on the end of that. I think he was playing around a little bit much, but overall, I thought that's really good. And then Do You Want to Dance the Way It Just Enters? That's another song that just enters with the chorus right away. Boom, right in. It's like, it won't be long. It's like these 2 albums. Mm-hmm. The first track is just pulls you right in. And interesting how you were saying that it's like the first half and the second half. I think I found myself liking the first half better.
Yep. I would agree with that.
The last 2 songs I think are my least favorite.
Yep.
I think that they drag. What is it? She Knows Me Too Well and In the Back of My Mind. I think I would like this album better if they just chopped those off. Now, maybe musically that he was experimenting and that would lead to other things, and that's great. But as far as as Matt's concerned, listening to this album, I probably would stop it there. And I think that it'd be almost, I don't know, everything else I really liked. And I thought that there was a part in Dance, Dance, Dance towards the end. They do something in that song, and it's hard for they kind of you kind of have gone through a verse or two, and you know where it's going, but then all of a sudden they throw in this note. It's a little bit higher. I don't know if it's like a half step or a full step higher, but they throw in this little thing. It's an unexpected twist, but it all fits in, and it reminded me of the beginning of "Wouldn't It Be Nice" on Pet
Are you talking about the Are you talking about the treble clef? Is that what you're talking about? Because Brian Wilson sang that quite a bit.
Well, it's probably. I mean, it wasn't a low register, but it was just. It's like, ooh, like that. I wasn't expecting that, because they threw in a little curveball at you, and I appreciate, that stuff is kind of cool. So I like this. It's a good album. I would recommend it. I think that my own personal biases with the vocals and stuff. It's just it's great, but I only want so much of it before I'm ready to move on to something else. So, but I would recommend this.
I can understand that.
I think the Beach Boys, they make that harmony and the layering sound so easy. They make it look easy, right? And
I could do that.
It's not at all. And it takes a critical listen to kind of pull out those different harmonies and parts that you can sing and the different strands and the things that Brian Wilson builds into the songs. And I think that's where I'm getting the rewards for careful listens of these Beach Boys albums is knowing. A really good example of this actually is in the movie Love and Mercy, which is a Beach Boys about Brian Wilson. Yep. And they have a really great scene in that where he's in his head putting the song together, and it adds the different things. I think this is when they were doing Pet Sounds, and it adds the different aspects, and it builds and builds and builds, and you can see the song coming together, sonically in his head. And that's like when it clicked for me when I saw that, like how like you said, John, how virtuosity or how virtuistic he was in the band as a whole. So that's kind of the value I get out of listening to this album.
And I'll just end with anyone who's ever been in a choir and, for a female, maybe going between alto and soprano and that land that exists between those two parts. And, for me, I remember singing tenor and then baritone and trying to figure that. And that's wide swaths, right? To think that this band, there's, Carl, Dennis, and Al could go back and forth between G, A, and B whenever needed to, right? Mike Love could go from bass to E to middle C, and then, Brian Wilson could sing the second D and then sing treble, clef, and falsetto. And I know that's deep dig stuff, but for those who may be listening that have experience in that, that's ridiculous. And because it's not like you're like, oh, when Mike Love sings, bass, he sounds great when he sings bass, and he sings great when he sounds middle C. And there isn't really a Beach Boys song, even the ones later in this album, that were a little bit plodding because they were almost like construction pieces for Brian Wilson and too many ballads in a row. But there's never a song that doesn't sound good, and that's because their voices are just incredible. And and for me, once again, it goes back to that idea of, the Beach Boys are a very, and by their own words, they are a decidedly white barbershop style sounding group, but they're in their own way the equals of the Temptations, the Four Tops, the Supremes, groups that did it with a little bit more of a soul twinge. And that's my takeaway. If I can totally understand the lyrical content not being there, them being spoiled for you from whatever they've been over the last 30 years. I often wonder if Brian Wilson dies in an overdose in 1969, right? And then the Beach Boys decide not to play after, and he releases Smile, which, a lot of, remember, he doesn't release Smile, and that's supposed to be the album that follows Sgt. Pepper. He releases it later, and it's ridiculously critically acclaimed. You have to wonder if they keep that going and they release Smile, what comes later for the Beatles.
Well,
Well,
what came later? I mean, it's the number one song played on Spotify. Freaking Kokomo, man.
We won't even get into that because I think
being on Full House.
I think
John Stamos is playing with him still. I think.
I think
what about
Kokomo.
John Stamos? How about his harmonies?
Kokomo in the 80s, 90s, 00s, Beach Boys have done so much harm to what like I said, there's a part of me that wonders if the Beach Boys drop Smile when they're supposed to, instead of like a watered down Smiley Smile, the album that came out, and then say they end on Sunflower in 1970, I think we're talking about the Beach Boys very different. I just think a lot of what permeates with the Beach Boys is that they became surfing with the oldies Beach Boys, and it's hard to unhear that. It's hard to unthink of what that became, instead of a group that just played from 1961 to 1970 and just churned out a Beatles type career, which they would have had if they stopped in 1970. So there you go. That's my end take. Listen to it, you'll like it, especially if you like pop music.